My wife thinks I'm wasting my time as I come here to give you all these stories. Are we going to let her keep saying that? Let's prove her wrong. Hit that subscribe button. Travis, I see you've requested supervised visitation only and a psychological evaluation of Mr. Travis before any custody modifications. Given what I witnessed today, and given Mr. Travis's DUI arrest this week, I'm granting your request. Visitation is suspended pending evaluation. We'll reconvene in 60 days. The gavel fell. Joe exploded. You can't do this. I have rights. You have responsibilities, Mr. Travis, which you've demonstrated poor judgment in exercising. 60 days. Dismissed. As they left the courthouse, Elizabeth holding both Sarah's and Conrad's hands, Marsh delivered his parting warning. This isn't over. We'll appeal. We'll file in federal court. We'll make sure every judge in Virginia knows the Hells Angels are interfering with parental rights. Conrad met his eyes, looking forward to it. Because every appeal is more time for Elizabeth to be safe. And every filing is more documentation of Joe being exactly what we say he is. 60 days of supervised visitation suspension should have been victory enough. But Joe Travis had never learned that sometimes you lose battles and move on with your life. Instead, he did what entitled men always do when they can't control their victims legally. He tried to control them through fear. The escalation started small. Hang-up calls to Sarah's cell phone at 2 a.m., empty beer cans left on her apartment doorstep, Joe's BMW driving slowly past her coffee shop during work hours, just visible through the window. A reminder he was watching. The Hells Angels documented everything, logged times, took photos, filed reports with Arlington PD that went nowhere because technically Joe wasn't violating the restraining order that technically didn't exist because judges kept denying Sarah's requests for one. He's allowed to drive on public streets, the desk sergeant explained when Sarah filed her 4th complaint in 2 weeks. He's allowed to call his ex-wife. Unless he threatens you directly, there's nothing we can do. So I have to wait until he hurts someone? Sarah asked. The sergeant had the decency to look uncomfortable. Ma'am, I wish I could tell you different, but that's how the system works. The system. Always the system. Conrad had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes systems were what got good people killed while policy wonks debated proper protocols. He'd watched Emma die because the system decided maintaining parental rights mattered more than maintaining pulse rates. He'd be damned if he'd watch it happen again. Week 3 of the 60-day suspension, Joe stopped pretending to be subtle. Sarah's apartment was broken into while she was at work and Elizabeth was at preschool. Nothing stolen, just furniture moved, photos rehung upside down, a message that said, I can get to you whenever I want. Arlington PD filed a report, dusted for prints that came back clean because Joe was smart enough to wear gloves. Marsh sent a formal letter denying his client had anything to do with the break-in and suggesting Sarah's biker friends might be staging incidents to frame Joe. He's escalating toward violence, Doc said at Thursday night church meeting, 6 weeks into the suspension with 2 weeks left before the next custody hearing. Breaking and entering is testing boundaries. Next step is direct confrontation, probably armed. Let him come, Chain said, the kind of statement that sounded like eagerness but was really math. Better a confrontation they controlled than one Joe chose. We know he's watching. We let him see an opening. He takes it. We respond with appropriate force. Appropriate force gets us arrested, jury countered. Joe's lawyer is waiting for us to fuck up. One wrong move and Sarah loses Elizabeth permanently because we proved we're exactly what Marsh says. Violent criminals. using intimidation. Conrad had been quiet, listening, calculating the kind of tactical problem they'd trained for in the Marines. How do you protect civilians when the rules of engagement favor the enemy? We need Joe to incriminate himself. On camera. Unambiguously. Something even bought judges can't ignore. How? Brick asked. By giving him what he wants. Access to Elizabeth. The room went silent. Sarah, who'd been sitting in the corner because Conrad had insisted she be part of strategy sessions about her daughter's safety, spoke up with the voice of someone who'd learned terror and was trying to remember courage. You want to use my daughter as bait? No, Conrad said. I want to use me. Joe doesn't actually want Elizabeth, he wants control. Wants to prove Sarah can't keep him away, wants to punish her for leaving. Elizabeth's just the weapon he's using, so we give him a different target. He explained. Saturday morning, Sarah would take Elizabeth to the playground at Bluebird Park. Conrad would be visible, present. The biker boyfriend Joe hated. Surveillance teams would cover every angle with cameras. If Joe showed up, and he would, because rage didn't do patience, and if he confronted Conrad violently, they'd have everything they needed. Footage of Joe initiating assault, threatening a child's caretaker, violating the spirit, if not the letter of custody agreements. And if he brings a weapon? Preacher asked. Then we respond proportionally. And Arlington PD finally has to admit Joe Travis is exactly what Sarah's been saying for 3 years. Saturday came with autumn sun and the kind of crisp air that made Virginia beautiful for about 3 weeks before winter killed everything. Elizabeth played on swings while Sarah pushed her, both of them pretending this was normal, that armed bikers weren't positioned in vehicles around the park perimeter, that Conrad wasn't sitting on a bench reading a newspaper he wasn't actually reading. Joe arrived at 10:47 a.m., parking his BMW in the far lot, walking across grass with the stride of someone who'd made a decision and was committed. He'd been drinking, not stumbling drunk, but enough that restraint was negotiable. You, he said, stopping 10 feet from Conrad. You're the reason my family's destroyed. Conrad set down the newspaper, stayed seated, kept his voice level. Your family's destroyed because you hit your daughter and your ex-wife got smart enough to leave. I never... Joe caught himself, aware dimly that this was public, that people were watching. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm a good father. Sarah turned her against me with lies. And you criminal piece of shit, you helped her. Yep, Conrad said. Guilty. I helped a woman protect her kid from a drunk who thought ownership was the same as love. Joe's hand went to his jacket pocket. Conrad saw it. So did Brick and Chains, who'd been positioned 20 yards away pretending to work on a bike. So did the cameras jury had mounted in 3 different trees with angles covering the entire confrontation. You don't get to take my daughter, Joe said, hand still in his pocket. I have rights. You have responsibilities you failed, Conrad replied, standing now, using the height advantage and 20 years of combat experience to communicate without words that whatever Joe thought he could do, Conrad had survived worse. And when fathers fail their daughters this badly, sometimes other men have to step up. Joe pulled the knife, folding blade 4 inches, the kind you bought at gas stations and thought made you dangerous. He didn't lunge, didn't attack, just held it visible, shaking, trying to look threatening. I could kill you right now, Joe whispered, for taking my family. You could try, Conrad said, but there's cameras everywhere. Your ex-wife is filming, and those 2 bikers behind you are former military who've disarmed actual trained killers. So your options are put the knife away and walk, or try something stupid and spend the next decade in prison for assault with deadly weapon in front of witnesses. Joe looked around, saw Sarah filming on her phone, saw Brick and Chains approaching, saw playground parents pulling their kids away, saw the trap he'd walked into. "This isn't over," he said, folding the knife but not pocketing it, waving it generally in Conrad's direction. Enough to be threatening on camera, not enough to be attempted murder. "I'll get my daughter back, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you are." He walked away, got in his BMW, drove off. Jury had everything on 3 angles of video. Joe approaching, confronting, pulling the weapon, threatening. Enough for assault charges, enough to violate custody agreements, enough to prove Sarah had been right all along. Arlington PD arrived 20 minutes later after Sarah filed the report in person at the station. This time, the desk sergeant who'd told her there was nothing they could do watched the video and said something different. "Ma'am, we'll issue a warrant for Mr. Travis's arrest. This is clear-cut assault with a deadly weapon." Monday morning, Joe was arrested at his law office in Rosslyn. Marsh tried to spin it. His client had been provoked, had felt threatened by bikers, had only brandished the knife in self-defense. The video disagreed. Judge Morrison watched Joe wave a knife at a man, while that man's girlfriend and her 5-year-old daughter stood 15 feet away, and made a decision that felt like justice for the first time in 3 years. "Mr. Travis, I'm terminating your unsupervised visitation rights pending criminal trial. Any future contact with Elizabeth will be supervised by court-appointed monitors. Your custody petition is denied." The gavel fell. Joe screamed about rights and alienation and corruption. Marsh filed notices of appeal that would go nowhere. And Sarah cried in the hallway while Elizabeth colored pictures of butterflies, safe for the first time in her young life. 3 months after the knife incident, Joe Travis took a plea deal. 2 years probation, mandatory anger management, supervised visitation only with therapist approval, restraining order making it illegal to come within 500 feet of Sarah or Elizabeth except during approved visits. His lawyer called it a victory. Sarah called it breathing room. Conrad called it unfinished business. Because men like Joe didn't learn, they adapted. The supervised visit started in January at a court-approved facility in Falls Church where a therapist named Dr. Raymond Chen observed through one-way glass while Joe spent 60 minutes with Elizabeth trying to convince a 5-year-old that Daddy wasn't the monster she remembered. Elizabeth spent most of the first visit coloring in silence. Joe asked questions she answered in one-word sentences, her body language screaming discomfort every time he tried to move closer. Dr. Chen's report to the court was clinical and devastating. Child exhibits significant anxiety in father's presence, including avoidance behavior, minimal eye contact, and regressive speech patterns. Recommend continued therapy before increasing visitation frequency. Joe blamed Sarah for poisoning their relationship, blamed Conrad for interference, blamed everyone except the person responsible himself. By March, the visits had increased to twice a month, always supervised, always documented, always ending with Elizabeth asking Sarah if they had to come back. "The law says yes, baby," Sarah would explain, hating herself for it, but understanding that courts believed maintaining parental contact was therapeutic, even when children screamed no with their bodies, if not their words. Conrad watched this from a distance. He hated. The custody agreement specified Sarah couldn't bring inappropriate associates to pick up or drop off, which Marsh had explicitly defined as Hell's Angels members. So Conrad waited in parking lots 3 blocks away, engine idling, ready to respond if Sarah called with the emergency code word they'd established. knowing Joe was too smart now to violate the restraining order, obviously, but not trusting that probation and anger management had changed anything fundamental about a man who thought love and ownership were synonyms. April brought the complication Conrad had been dreading: Elizabeth's 6th birthday. Sarah planned a small party at their apartment. Just a few preschool friends, Elizabeth's teacher, cake, and presents, and the normal childhood Joe had spent 5 years denying her. The custody agreement said Joe could attend if he wanted, supervised by Sarah, his presence a test of whether he could exist in his daughter's life without dominating it. "I don't want him there," Sarah told Conrad over coffee at their regular Starbucks in Ballston, where they'd fallen into a routine of planning, worrying, and pretending they weren't falling into something neither of them had time to examine. "But his lawyer says refusing will look like I'm alienating him again." "So let him come," Conrad said. "I'll be there. Not as your boyfriend, though they were heading that direction even if neither admitted it, but as a friend. If he starts anything, we document. If he behaves, Elizabeth gets a birthday without drama. Either way, she wins." Saturday afternoon, Sarah's apartment filled with 6-year-olds hopped up on sugar and cartoon characters. Joe arrived at 3 p.m., sober, dressed appropriately, carrying a present wrapped too perfectly to be his work. He smiled at Elizabeth with the desperation of someone trying to perform fatherhood for an audience instead of feeling it genuinely. "Happy birthday, Lizzie. Daddy got you something special." Elizabeth took the present with the politeness children learn when adults teach them to accept things they don't want. Opened it to find an expensive doll she'd never play with because it came from him. "Thank you," she said, the words automatic, empty. Joe's smile cracked. He'd spent $200 on a gift his daughter received like a stranger's obligation, and Conrad watched him calculate whether this was worth the performance, whether loving a child who'd learned to fear you was possible, whether redemption existed for fathers who'd destroyed trust before their daughters were old enough to spell the word. For 90 minutes, Joe behaved, sat on the couch, made small talk with parents who knew his history and gave him polite distance, watched Elizabeth blow out candles without trying to take over the moment. Conrad almost believed it was working. Then Elizabeth opened her last present from Conrad. He hadn't planned to give her anything public, but Sarah had insisted. "You're part of her life. She should know it." Inside the box was a small leather jacket, child-sized, with a patch sewn on the back, a teddy bear riding a motorcycle. Underneath, in careful stitching, "Protected by the Reaper." Elizabeth's face lit up in a way it hadn't for any other gift, including her father's expensive doll. "Mr. Conrad, it's like your jacket." She ran to him, hugged him, asked if she could wear it now. Please, right now. Conrad helped her into it, the leather hanging loose but wearable. And when Elizabeth twirled to show everyone, she looked at Joe and said the words that detonated his fragile composure. "This is my favorite present ever, because Conrad's my real protector, like a real dad." The room went silent. Parents sensed the shift. Sarah moved instinctively between Joe and Elizabeth, and Joe stood, face red, hands clenched, voice shaking with rage he'd been swallowing for months. "I'm your real dad, not him. Me. I'm the one who has rights, who pays child support, who hurt Mommy?" Elizabeth said, 6 years old and done pretending adults deserved politeness when they'd never shown her safety. "Who scared me? Who made me cry?" "Conrad doesn't do that. Conrad's nice." Joe looked at Conrad with hatred that promised this wasn't over. restraining orders and probation be damned. You turned my daughter against me. You destroyed my family. No, Conrad said quietly, aware of the audience, aware this was being recorded by at least 3 parents, aware that what he said next would either de-escalate or explode. You did that yourself. I just showed up when she needed someone to pretend to be her dad because you weren't acting like one. And somewhere along the way it stopped being pretend. Joe grabbed for Elizabeth. Not violently, not obviously, just reached for her like he had the right, like biology trumped terror. Sarah blocked him. Conrad stood, and Elizabeth ran, not away from the room, but toward Conrad, pressing against his leg the same way she had in the parking garage 9 months ago, when she'd first learned that sometimes the scariest-looking people are the safest. "You need to leave," Sarah said, voice steady despite hands shaking. "This is my home. You're here by permission, and you just upset your daughter at her birthday party." "I'm calling my lawyer," Joe said, pulling out his phone like it was a weapon. "Marsh is going to hear about this. Hostile environment, parental alienation, evidence everywhere." "Good," Conrad said. "Call him. Show him the video of you grabbing for Elizabeth after she told you she was scared of you. Let Judge Morrison see how well you're doing with anger management." Joe left, slamming the door, promising lawsuits and custody modifications and revenge. The party continued, but the joy had leaked out, replaced by the exhaustion of people constantly at war. Later, after guests left and Elizabeth fell asleep on the couch, still wearing her leather jacket, Sarah poured wine for herself and Conrad and asked the question that had been building for months. "How long can we do this? The surveillance, the documentation, the constant fear he's going to do something that forces a confrontation?" "As long as it takes," Conrad said, "because the alternative is letting him win." "And what's winning look like for us?" Sarah asked. "Does this ever end?" Conrad looked at Elizabeth sleeping, safe, protected, no longer running from monsters because monsters had learned she had guardians. "It ends when she's old enough that courts care what she wants. It ends when Joe finally accepts he lost. Or it ends when—" He didn't finish. Didn't want to say the thing they both knew. It ends when Joe pushes too far and Conrad stops pulling punches. "I'm falling in love with you," Sarah said suddenly. The kind of confession that comes when exhaustion lowers walls. Which is probably stupid because you're a biker with a record, and I'm a single mom with an ex-husband who wants us both dead, and this whole thing is complicated and dangerous and... Conrad kissed her. Gentle, brief. The kind of kiss that said, "I know, me too. We'll figure it out." When they pulled apart, Sarah was crying. "I don't want you to get hurt protecting us." "Too late," Conrad said. "Been hurt, been broken, been to war and back. This is what makes it mean something." Outside, Joe Travis sat in his BMW 3 blocks away, watching Sarah's apartment building through binoculars, drinking bourbon from a flask, planning something that would either get him his daughter back or destroy everyone who'd taken her away. Joe's endgame came in June, 14 months after Conrad had first told Elizabeth to pretend he was her dad. The restraining order was still active. The supervised visitation was still mandatory. But Joe had spent a year watching his daughter choose a biker over him, watching Sarah build a life where he was irrelevant, watching courts side with the woman he'd spent years controlling. So he did what abusers do when they can't have what they want. He decided if he couldn't win, everyone would lose. Sarah's coffee shop closed at 6 p.m. on weekdays. Elizabeth stayed with Conrad those evenings while Sarah handled closing duties, cleaning machines, counting registers, a routine that had become family structure. Conrad would pick Elizabeth up from aftercare, take her to the clubhouse where Preacher's wife had set up a kids' corner, let her color and play while he handled club business. At 7, he'd take her home. Sarah would arrive by 7:30, and they'd have dinner like a family that was pretending to be normal until they forgot they were pretending. June 14th, a Thursday. Conrad's phone rang at 6:47 while Elizabeth was showing him a drawing of a motorcycle with a teddy bear driver. Sarah's name lit up the screen. Her voice was wrong, too controlled, too calm, the way people sound when they're being forced to perform normalcy. "Hey, Conrad. Sorry to bother you, but Joe stopped by the shop. He wants to talk about Elizabeth's summer schedule. Can you bring her here so we can discuss it together?" Every alarm Conrad had developed in Fallujah started screaming. Sarah never asked him to bring Elizabeth anywhere near Joe. Summer schedule discussions happened through lawyers, not coffee shop parking lots. And her voice had the flatness of someone with a gun to their head. "Sure," Conrad said, matching her forced calm. "Be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, looked at Elizabeth. "Hey, kiddo, we need to go pick up your mom, but I want you to do something for me. Stay with Miss Rachel, Preacher's wife, until I get back, okay?" "Is Mommy okay?" Elizabeth asked with the instincts children develop when they grow up in war zones disguised as families. "She's fine. Just some adult stuff. I'll bring her back soon." He handed Elizabeth to Rachel, pulled Brick and Chains aside, explained in combat shorthand, "Hostage situation. Sarah's compromised. Joe's forcing a meet. Need backup. Armed. Ready for worst case." 3 Harleys rolled out of the clubhouse at 6:52, Conrad leading with the tactical awareness of someone who'd cleared buildings in Ramadi and wasn't about to let an entitled suburban drunk outmaneuver him. They arrived at Sarah's coffee shop at 7:09. Joe's BMW was parked directly in front, engine off. Through the windows, Conrad could see Sarah behind the counter, Joe in front of it, positioning that put him between her and the exit. Conrad dismounted, hand signals telling Brick and Chains to cover side and back exits. He walked in through the front door, and Joe turned with the smile of someone who thought he'd finally gained the upper hand. "Conrad, thanks for coming. We need to talk about you and Sarah poisoning my daughter against me." "Elizabeth's not here," Conrad said, assessing. Joe's right hand was in his jacket pocket, shoulders tense, eyes too wide. Drunk, armed, desperate. Sarah behind the counter was pale, trying to communicate something with her eyes that Conrad already understood. "He has a gun. He's going to hurt someone. I called you to warn you not walk into a trap." "I know she's not here," Joe said. "That's the point. For once, we have a conversation without my daughter watching you play dad. Without you interfering. Just you, me, and Sarah figuring out how this ends. How it ends is you get therapy, follow your custody agreement, and let Elizabeth grow up without fear," Conrad said. "That's the only ending where everyone survives." "Survives," Joe laughed. The sound cracked. "You think you're protecting them. You think you're the hero. But you're just a criminal who convinced my family he was worth something. And now I'm going to show everyone what happens when bikers interfere with family law." He pulled the gun, Glock 19, loaded, safety off, pointed at Conrad's chest. Sarah screamed. Brick and Chains were through the back door before Joe could turn, flanking him. Chains with his own weapon drawn, Brick moving to put himself between Joe and Sarah. "You really want to do this?" Conrad asked, voice calm despite the pistol pointed at center mass. Shoot me in front of witnesses? With bikers who will absolutely return fire? With Sarah here who you're supposedly trying to win back? How does this end well for you?" "It doesn't," Joe said, and the admission was what made this deadly. He'd stopped caring about consequences. "But it ends you, and that's enough." The shot came from somewhere Conrad hadn't cleared. The rookie mistake that got Marines killed, he'd focused on Joe and missed Joe's friend Greg from the law firm, who'd been hiding in the storage room, also armed, also desperate to help his buddy reclaim masculine honor through violence. The bullet hit Conrad in the left shoulder, spinning him, dropping him, pain exploding through nerve clusters as his brain categorized, through and through, missed bone, survivable. But he was down, and Joe had a clear shot at finishing it. Brick fired twice, center mass, both rounds hitting Joe's bulletproof vest, because of course Joe had worn a vest to his murder-suicide plan. Joe staggered, didn't drop, raised his weapon toward Sarah, who was screaming Conrad's name. Conrad on the ground, bleeding, made the calculation every combat veteran makes when someone threatens the people they've promised to protect. He pulled his own weapon, concealed carry he'd started bringing after the birthday party just in case, and fired once, not at Joe's chest, at his right shoulder. Disabling, not killing, because Elizabeth didn't need to grow up knowing her biological father had been killed by the man she called her real protector. Joe dropped the gun, screaming, collapsing. Greg bolted out the back door, ran directly into Chains, who put him on the ground without firing another shot. Arlington PD arrived 4 minutes later to a scene that would require a dozen reports. 2 men down with gunshot wounds, 1 biker bleeding from shoulder injury, 3 bikers with weapons drawn, self-defense claimed, 6 cameras recording everything. Conrad stayed conscious long enough to see Sarah unharmed, to tell responding officers that Joe had fired first, to watch paramedics arrive. Then he let the pain drag him under, with the satisfaction of knowing Elizabeth was safe at the clubhouse and would never have to run from her father again. Conrad woke in Virginia Hospital Center with his left shoulder immobilized, an IV dripping something that made the world soft-edged, and Sarah asleep in the chair beside his bed, holding his right hand like she'd let go and he'd disappear. The clock said 3:47 a.m. He'd been unconscious for 8 hours. "You're awake," Sarah said, jolting alert when he shifted. "Don't move. Doctor said the bullet went through clean, but you need to stay still." "Elizabeth?" Conrad asked, voice rough from anesthesia. "With Preacher and Rachel at the clubhouse. She knows you got hurt, but she doesn't know details. Rachel told her you protected Mommy, and now you're healing like a superhero." "Joe?" "Surgery. Stable. Under arrest for attempted murder, assault with deadly weapon, about 17 other charges. His lawyer can't spin this. Marsh actually resigned from the case. Said Joe had become too unstable to represent effectively." Sarah laughed, broken and relieved. "He's done, Conrad. Really done. The prosecutor said Joe's looking at 10 to 15 years. His parental rights are being terminated. Elizabeth is safe." Conrad closed his eyes, feeling something release that he'd been carrying since Emma died. The crushing weight of failure, of being too late, of not protecting someone who'd needed him. This time he'd been there. This time he'd stopped the monster. This time the little girl got to grow up. "You got shot protecting us," Sarah whispered. "You could have died. Why would you do that?" "Because when I told Elizabeth to pretend I was her dad, I meant it. And dads don't walk away when danger comes, even if the danger has legal custody." Sarah kissed him, careful of his injuries, gentle, tasting like coffee and tears and relief. I love you, and Elizabeth loves you. And I know this is complicated, and you're a biker with a record, and I'm a disaster of a single mom, but we're family, Conrad interrupted. Not pretend, real. And family protects each other. Forever. 3 months later, after Conrad's shoulder healed and Joe's trial ended with guilty verdicts and a 15-year sentence, after Sarah's custody of Elizabeth was made permanent and uncontested, after the Hells Angels threw a party that celebrated protecting one more kid the system had failed, Conrad did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He visited Emma's grave in Arlington National Cemetery and told her about Elizabeth. I know she's not you. I know nothing replaces you. But she needed someone, and I was there this time. And I think maybe you sent her to me. A second chance. A reminder that fatherhood isn't about blood. It's about showing up. He placed flowers on Emma's headstone and raised 2 fingers in the biker salute that meant ride safe. You're never alone. Family forever. When he turned to leave, Sarah and Elizabeth were waiting by his bike. Elizabeth wore her leather jacket with the protected by the Reaper patch, and she ran to him with the fearless joy of a child who'd learned that safety was possible. Uncle Conrad, can I sit on your motorcycle? Not uncle, Conrad said, looking at Sarah, who nodded through tears. Daddy. You can call me Daddy now, if you want. Elizabeth's face transformed into pure happiness. Really? You're my real daddy now? I was always your real daddy, Conrad said, kneeling to her eye level the way he had in the parking garage 14 months ago when this had started with pretend I'm your dad. From the moment you trusted me to protect you. Because family isn't about who makes you, it's about who saves you. He lifted Elizabeth onto his bike, Sarah climbed on behind him, and they rode through Arlington with the autumn sun warming leather and chrome. 3 people who'd started as strangers in a parking garage and become family through violence, courage, and the stubborn refusal to let monsters win. At a stoplight, another biker pulled alongside, Hell's Angel from a different chapter, older, grizzled, someone who recognized Conrad's colors. They exchanged the 2-finger salute, the universal biker language that said, "Ride safe, brother, we see you." The light changed. Conrad throttled forward, Elizabeth laughing, Sarah holding tight, and for the first time since Emma died, Conrad understood that redemption wasn't about replacing what you lost. It was about protecting what remained. And sometimes, when you told a little girl to pretend you were her dad, you ended up discovering that love didn't need biology. It just needed someone brave enough to stand between monsters and innocence and refuse to walk away. When a biker becomes your friend, they're your friend forever. And when a biker becomes your family, even if it started as pretend, they'll burn the world down to keep you safe.